Throughout the course of history, there have been many people who have caused trouble, ranging from robbers to murderers. Learn the tried and true methods for meting out justice to people whose behavior is unacceptable. In this video, we will discuss 10 of the most interesting and obscure punishments from throughout history. Grampusing. People serving in the military might expect severe punishment if they fail to carry out their responsibilities correctly, because the successful defense against an enemy assault can depend on a single guard keeping watch. Personnel who are careless with their responsibilities need to be trained to respect their positions. During the time of King Henry VIII, sailors in the Royal Navy were subjected to harsh punishments for committing offenses of this nature. The guys who fell asleep on duty received 3 strikes, with the severity of their penalty increasing after each strike. After the watchman had fallen asleep for the 4th time, he was placed in a basket at the front of the boat, where he was then chained and given food and a knife to eat. The guard had the option of either starving to death or cutting himself free so that he could swim out to open water. Grampusing was the method that was going to be used as the punishment for the subsequent offense. The following instructions were given to King Henry VIII's navy by King Henry VIII, who ordered that this punishment be carried out. The 2nd time he shall be armed, his hands shall be held up by a rope, and 2 buckets of water shall be poured into his sleeves. When the water was poured down the man's sleeves, he let out a loud gagging sound and made a lot of commotion. This squeak was quite reminiscent to the sound that a grampus, which is a species of dolphin, would make, which is how the punishment earned its name. Drunkard's cloak. Although some punishments were designed to cause the offender physical pain, others were conceived solely with the intention of making the criminal feel ashamed. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the drunkard's cloak was a form of retribution that was given to individuals who were found to be intoxicated in public. This was the purpose of the cloak. The culprit would be required to don the drunkard's cloak, which was a barrel with holes that left room for a person's head and limbs to protrude through the top. The drunkard's cloak was not intended to do the offender any physical injury or to restrict their movement in any other way. But all it took was for him to see a man wandering around town wearing a barrel as a cloak for him to understand the significance of drinking in a responsible manner. In addition to that, the drinker was required to provide 5 shillings to the needy. Because of the positive reception that this strategy received, it was quickly adopted as a common form of discipline in England. Additionally, it started to spread throughout Europe. It was given the name Schanmantel, which literally translates to coat of shame, after it was adopted by Germany. A more sinister variety known as the Spanish mantle was designed to function less like a cloak and more like a pillory. While the criminal was being imprisoned in the barrel, he would have to kneel in his own waste and be dependent on the kindness of others to feed him. This is, of course, assuming that anyone would offer food at all. Cangai. Around the time period including the 17th century, the Kang method of punishment was first recorded in China. Kang was carried out in a number of different ways, but the basic principle remained the same. The culprit was confined within a wooden frame that secured his neck in place. On the opposite side, all that was visible was his head. The culprit was unable to put his hands to his mouth due to the substantial nature of the frame. Because he was unable to provide for himself, the people in his community were responsible for providing him with food and assisting him with the activities of daily living. Some iterations of the Kang consisted simply of the neck collar, which made it possible for the victim to move around while still being restrained by the device. The severity of the Kang's weight was adjusted to correspond with the offense. It was said that some Kang weighed approximately 90 kilograms, which frequently caused the offender to pass away as a result of the tension. Another variation included a cage that went all the way around it and held the criminal in place. These canaries were frequently stationed in public locations. There are portable Kangs that have the capacity to hold multiple criminals at once. Welsh knot. It was noted in a book published by the British government in 1847 that the educational system in Wales was performing very poorly. The pupils lacked proper education and were unmotivated to learn. In addition to that, they were held in deplorable conditions. This book is known by the Welsh as the Treason of the Blue Books at this point in time. When the report was being compiled, the commissioners came to the conclusion that the only way to conserve the Welsh language was for its speakers to begin using English as their primary language. At school, children from Wales were only permitted to speak the English language. Those who were found speaking their native tongue in public were subjected to the Welsh not as a kind of punishment. The Welsh Not was a block made of wood that had the words Welsh Not, or WN, engraved into it. If someone was overheard speaking Welsh, they were awarded the token as a reward. If the person who was currently in possession of the token heard someone else speaking Welsh, then that person might give the Welsh Not token to the other person who was caught speaking Welsh. The child who possessed the Welsh Not at the conclusion of the day was given a spanking. There were no legal restrictions placed on the usage of the Welsh Not. It was up to the discretion of each headmaster to decide whether or not he would utilize this method of disciplining his pupils. However, prior to the event, permission had to be obtained from the parents. Treadmills. The treadmill, which was primarily employed as a form of punishment in British jails throughout the 19th century, was quite similar to the exercise machines that are used today. On the other hand, the treadmill in the prison was designed to resemble more like a water wheel than a moving surface, and its user was required to do a climbing motion rather than a running motion while using it. These treadmills were not intended to be used as fitness equipment. Instead, inmates were made to walk on them for 8 hours a day with only brief breaks in between. The repetitive and arduous nature of the task was designed to discourage inmates from committing additional offenses. Additionally, treadmills could be connected to the gear. The treadmills in Bedford Prison were used to generate power for the facility's flour mill. Because this activity generated revenue for the facility, the inmate was able to legitimately earn his keep through its participation. However, as time went on, the connection to the machinery began to weaken, and the treadmill eventually evolved into a straightforward form of punishment that involved walking. Trial by ordeal. The trial by ordeal was a form of punishment that was known as judicium Dei, Latin for judgment by God. At a time when it was difficult to acquire conclusive proof, individuals often appealed to the will of God to decide whether or not a person was guilty of a crime. The type of trial that will be administered to the accused person will be determined by the court. It was said that only a miracle from God could get you through each test that you had to take. If the person was successful, it indicated that God had shown mercy on the individual accused of the crime and that he was not guilty of the offense. If he was unsuccessful, it meant that God had abandoned him and he would be held accountable. One horrible example of this kind of punishment is the agony of the duel, in which the accused had to make it through a combat to prove their innocence. In order to complete the challenge of hot water, a person had to collect a stone by submerging their arms in hot water. If 3 days later his arms still bore the scars, he must have been responsible. However, there were some trials that didn't require as much of a miracle in order to be overcome. As part of the trial of the cross, both the accuser and the accused were required to face a cross while standing with their arms extended in front of them. The case was lost by the individual who was first to lower his arms. The torture of bleeding compelled a suspect in a murder to stare at the dead body of the person who had been murdered. If the dead body started bleeding again, the onlooker would be considered the killer. The accused person was required, as part of the trial of the blessed morsel, to consume some blessed cheese and dried bread. It was the offender's responsibility if he choked on his food while eating. Pitch capping. During the Irish Rebellion of 1798, pitch caps were most commonly used on those who were suspected of being rebels. The pitch cap was a conical hat that could be fashioned out of any material that was readily available, such as linen that was stiff. The suspect was placed in a headlock while boiling pitch was poured into the cone, and then the cap was placed on his head. The scalp and hair were pulled off along with the cap as it was taken off. After the pitch had cooled, several procedures included the addition of explosives to the hat, which was then set ablaze. It was customary for males to attend religious services without their heads covered. However, legend has it that Irish priests made an exception for people who had survived the practice of pitch capping and allowed them to cover the scars on their scalps with a handkerchief. Oakum picking. Picking oakum was another form of punishment that was used throughout the 18th and 19th centuries to encourage inmates to be productive while they were incarcerated. The term junk refers to old ropes that were salvaged from ships and was once utilized in the production of oakum. Oakum was created by picking apart the pieces of rubbish, which were then cut into pieces and used. After that, the oakum was combined with tar to generate a sealing mixture, which was stuffed into the cracks of wooden ships to ensure that they were impervious to water. Of course, the process of breaking up rope and physically extracting its threads was tedious for those who were incarcerated. Even while it was an effective form of punishment, many people were concerned that the inmates were getting off too easily. In the year 1824, the authorities at one prison mandated that inmates use treadmills for their punishment rather than sitting and picking at rope. However, some correctional facilities maintained the practice of selecting ropes as a form of punishment even after wooden ships were replaced by iron ones, rendering oakum obsolete. Picket. In late medieval Europe, the picket, sometimes known as the picket, was frequently used as a form of punishment, particularly in the military. After driving a stake into the ground, the blunt end of the spike was sharpened so that it formed a point. The culprit was kept in a position of suspension above the stake. There is some discrepancy in the records over whether or not the individual in issue was suspended by his thumb or his wrist. Criminals were hung at a height that permitted them to balance on the stake using only 1 foot while they were being executed. The point of the stake was sharp enough to be irritating, but not sharp enough to pierce the flesh. The condemned inmate was expected to remain affixed to the stake until the excruciating pain became intolerable. When he got to that stage, he was able to lift himself up to get some relief from the discomfort. However, that solution caused him to experience discomfort in his wrist or thumb. The end result was a form of corporal punishment in the form of a pick-your-poison method, which ultimately caused anguish throughout the body. Field punishment, number 1. When the practice of flogging was outlawed in the British Army in the year 1881, the authorities were forced to devise alternative methods of meting out justice to those who were responsible for less serious transgressions, such as intoxication. Field punishment. Number 1 was a sort of corporal punishment that was utilized up until the year 1920. Its nomenclature is somewhat peculiar. The offender was restrained for a number of hours each day, sometimes while being fastened to a wheel or a post, and a military officer would periodically examine his posture. During World War I, however, field punishment number 1 was significantly more severe than a simple dose of public shame. As one record from Private Frank Bastable demonstrated, this punishment could be life-threatening. When on parade for rifle inspection, after opening the bolts and closing them again the second time, as it did not suit the officer the first time, I accidentally let off a round. I had to go before the CO and got num 1 field punishment. I was tied up against a wagon by ankles and wrists for 2 hours a day, 1 hour in the morning and 1 in the afternoon in the middle of winter and under shell fire. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.